Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another special episode of the Reimagine podcast. Laura, do you want to set the stage?
Sure. So we are excited here today to have quite a few experts in the field of ESG. And again, this is part of a special partnership podcast series we have with the Barney School of Business. So our conversation today is going to bring us through a lot of the whys, the hows, and kind of getting to the heart of what is it and why is it important to us? So to help set that stage, we have with us on the podcast episode today, John Thompson, Assistant Dean, Career Ready Programs at UHeart, the Barney School of Business. We have Anthony Sensman, a student at the Barney School of Business, a finance major with a passion for finance and problem solving. Bob Smith, President and Chief Investment Officer with Sage Advisory. Emma Harper, Senior Research Analyst, Sage Advisory, and Andy Pareda, Senior Research Analyst with Sage Advisory. So we have quite a group of individuals with us here today. And, let's just start right in. Anthony, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. My first question for Bob here would be, starting at a high level, what is ESG?
Sure. Thank you, Anthony, and good day to everybody. That's a question that has many different meanings for people. If you look under the umbrella of responsible investing, you'll hear terms like sustainable, ethical, green, ESG, social impact, socially responsible. It's a world of different terms, and the idea is, where does ESG kind of fit into this? What is ESG in the spectrum of all the things that we hear day to day? And so what I would like to do is I'll give you a way that we look at it, and then we can take it from there. But at its core, ESG investing is about influencing positive changes in society by being a better investor, by assessing a variety of factors that can have material financial impact on an entity's sustainability and its ability to generate long-term capital value for investors. So within ESG, what we're really looking at here are factors that are in the realm of environmental concerns, social concerns, corporate governance. These are all factors that will have impact on a company's overall performance over the long term. So by considering these factors, we are also taking a bit more of a holistic view of what is a company all about, and what are the risks that are not necessarily financial risks like I see on the P&L or on the balance sheet, but actually have direct impact on all of those numbers I see on those financial statements. And so this is kind of exercised through a closer look at basically three criteria. First is the environment. And here, what kind of impact does a company have on the environment? And what are we trying to get at when we do that? We want to look at the conservation of the natural world. What's going on around us? And I often tell people, look, environmental analysis is something that we all feel, we all smell, we all see. It's a very tactile experience. And so it's very easy for us to get a very clear understanding of what environmental impact means and who is creating that impact, beneficial or not beneficial. So we're looking at things like greenhouse gas emissions. We're looking at hazardous waste management. We look at water management, deforestation issues. We look at renewable energy programs, carbon intensity, and how is the company in terms of recycling its waste, and what waste management policies do they have? So there's a myriad of different issues under the environmental context that all of these have some bearing on the financial outcome. When we look at social, here again, we're looking at how a company improves its social impact, both within the company and also to the broader community. And so really what you're getting down to, the way I like to look at it, social means the soul of the company. How does it treat people, both internal to itself and external to itself? So we're going to look at things like supply chain management, employee training, fair labor practices, customer satisfaction, community involvement, data privacy and security, non-discrimination and sexual harassment policies. And then lastly, things like health and safety records and how well that company is embracing the value of its human capital not just as financial capital, and then also all the other stakeholders that make that company what it is today. And then lastly, we look at governance. And here governance is really the intellect, the intentionality and the execution of intention. And so when I look at governance, that's what I'm trying to assess from the management of the organization. So we were going to look at things like bribery and internal corruption policies. We're going to look at ESG performance targets. Do you have them? What is the diversity at the board level and also at the C-suite? What kind of board independence is there? Is it, just a bunch of buddies running the company, or is there actual independence on the board to arrive at the decisions that really are going to benefit all stakeholders? What's the remuneration? What kind of pay policies do they have? What about political involvement? So there's a whole bunch of issues under governance, but the reality there is, and what you're trying to get at, is how well run is this company across a bunch of different considerations and metrics. So for a lot of people, including ourselves, ESG goes beyond kind of the three-letter, an acronym of ESG. And really what you're looking at is, how does this company serve all stakeholders that make it what it is today? Its workers, the communities it operates in, the customers it serves, the shareholders, and basically the environment in which it operates. So if I'm looking at ESG, that to me is really what the definition is. That's the heart of it. That's what we're trying to get to.
Wow, thank you for that. You really opened things up for me there. That was a pretty intuitive response. A follow-up that comes to mind is, how did we get here with ESG? I know it's been a long road and you've been at the forefront of that, so it'd be great to get your perspective on that.
Sure. That's a good question, Andrew, because a lot of people think this is something that just came about over the course of the last decade. The reality is nothing could be further from the truth. If you really think back to the days of the settlers and many of the religious bodies that came from Europe that settled the United States, whether it's the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Quakers and so forth, you'll find that within their core values, there were many things that related to today's expression of ESG, and not only on social levels, but also environmental. So you can go all the way back to the 1700s, 1800s, and so forth, and find that that is where the whole notion of ESG actually got rooted, and then over time it became more and more expressed in a more formal sense. For me, the 70s, and I am a child of the 70s. That's I went through high school and college during those years. And it was a very important time because that's really where the whole ESG movement, the whole sustainable movement, really established, its footing. And in 1970, believe it or not, Richard Nixon established the EPA through executive order. So there can be some good things from executive orders. And we also had our first Earth Day. And today now we've got millions of Americans, people all around the world that celebrate Earth Day. But the early 70s was really, what I thought was the breakthrough moment. And then we go through the 80s, and we go through the 80s into the early 90s, and all of a sudden, people were looking at socially responsible investment. Alcohol, tobacco, pornography, various different forms of human labor issues, and how we were treating citizens around the world, areas like South Africa and so forth, apartheid, all of those came under consideration, and they also got they were woven into the ESG fabric, if you will, in terms of, what do we really aspire to, and how do we sustain ourselves to and get to a higher plane. Then you get to the 2000s, and in the 2000s is really where structure started to take place and framework started to assemble. And that was really led by Kofi Annan, who sadly is no longer with us, but he was the initiator of the UNPRI and the Principles for Responsible Investment. And it's through his efforts that he gathered, the economic powers of the world to really coalesce around the United Nations and really establish a framework, as we know them, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, that we should all aspire to and support for a better world. And from that time, we have seen a number of financial institutions now join forces with the UNPRI, which I'm happy to say we are a signatory and have been since 2017. But you have well over 3,500, almost 4,000 major financial institutions that are now supporting the principles for responsible investment. And there isn't indeed an insurance company, a bank, a major financial services firm today that's not on that list and does not subscribe to those principles and those values. So here we are today, now, looking at all this history and looking at the evolution, and I think that we're going to start to see the ball change, and the rate of change is going to start to pick up, like Moore's Law, right? And so yesterday we had the announcement of the SEC that just brought to bear on everybody within the U.S. system what they expect companies to do going forward in terms of reporting and acknowledging climate risk and what they're going to do about it and how they intend to carry it out and be able to be accountable and transparent about that. And so I think this is a big evolutionary step. Lord knows, since 1970, we never would have imagined this happened, but eventually, evolution does take us to things like yesterday. So I'll leave it there, but I think that's that'll give you a good background.
So Bob, let me just jump in. So if I'm an investor, I'm the chief investment officer at an insurance company, and I'm looking to where to allocate assets, and I put money in the ESG bucket. Am I sacrificing short-term gains for the social good? Is that always the case?
I don't believe that you are, and I think Emma, you might be able to jump in on that one.
Sure. Yeah. There's been numerous academic studies over the years that have looked at this exact question, right? Are you giving up performance? Are you giving up potential upside? Are the costs greater than what you're getting for ESG? And overall, it said no. The academic studies have come out and said you're getting the same return, if not better return. So for us, the benefits are numerous. We have risk management downside protection. If you look at the period of volatility coming from the COVID-19 pandemic, you can clearly see that, ESG definitely outperformed, the traditional counterparts in a big way through that due to the superior risk management and downside protection that it can give you. And also, we're not just looking at it for that kind of downside protection. We're also looking at it for opportunity, looking at business models that are seeking to take advantage of trends, macroeconomic trends, market trends that are facing us through, risks that we're facing in the future, whether that be environmental, social, etc. So we're looking at companies that are both taking advantage of opportunities and looking at risks and understanding, how to handle those risks more sustainably. So no, long-winded answer to that is, we see that you're going to get, same return, if not better return from ESG investments.
Mm-hmm.
So taking the look at it, and we're talking about investments, and there's accountability, transparency. Can one say, as people kind of wade into this ESG pond or this ocean of ESG, if you will, is ESG a barometer of right and wrong, or is it more so what we use, the metrics behind it, to make better informed decisions for either a company going forward? So is it something we can use as a barometer, or is it something that is not a barometer of good, bad, right, wrong, and more of a metrics platform that we can use to make better informed choices?
I think that there is no right and wrong, and I think there is fact.
Mm-hmm.
We are pragmatic in our approach to ESG, as I think everybody should be, and we should be certainly science-based, but we also have to use some degree of logic, and we have to understand what human nature is all about. As I've said to John, I said, the insurance in the insurance world is truly just a reflection of our environment and a reflection of our society and the challenges before it. It is the mirror, that reflects all of those concerns. And so if I looked at it from just purely a climate risk and how it may affect, let's say, just life and health companies and property casualty, you got to consider some of these things. And to the extent that everybody seems to these days admit there's some change in the climate that's going on. The causality we can debate, but it is indeed happening. So climate warming favors the spread of disease. Let's accept that. The second thing is that extreme weather events create conditions that are conducive to disease outbreaks, okay? So now let's take it further. It's like climate change and infectious disease threatens ecosystems. We know that. And that provides us with essential resources that constitute our life support systems, okay? So follow me through on the logic. So some impacts of warming and greater weather volatility could occur suddenly and then become more widespread. Look, it just happened over the last few weeks here going through the Midwest and, the terrible storms that we've all undergone. You look at it from the perspective of, let's say coastal human communities, coral reefs, look at the forests that, we are eliminating every single day, whether it's in the rainforest in Brazil, Indonesia, palm oil harvesting, or here just in the US. All of these things contribute to a less stable environment for the climate. And that instability creates an instability in terms of the general public health in many respects. And it impacts public safety. It impacts, kind of our security also from a national security standpoint. So I think the bottom line in all of this is that let's just stop looking at it from just the investment side. Let's look at it from the liability side of the equation. And we understand that climate change will affect the health of humans as well as the ecosystems and the species upon which they depend. It's happening. I've seen it. I've been to the Arctic. I've been to the Antarctic. I've seen it. I believe it. And these impacts are going to have definite economic consequences for anyone that wants to underwrite that risk, namely the insurance industry. And so if there is any agent for change in terms of the economic landscape, in terms of addressing climate risk appropriately, it's the insurance industry, bar none. Because as I've said, there is nothing you can do that's important in life without insurance supporting it. And therefore, insurance sets the rules for human behavior at a given price. Therefore, climate risk, in our opinion, is something that needs to be addressed by the insurance underwriting world, whether you're on the life side or whether you're on the PC side. And I think that's the power that insurance has. It isn't necessarily recognizing it in that sense, but that's how we see it. I hope that's a good answer for you.
Yeah, well, let's just, let's double click on that a little bit in the risks. I mean, there's some obvious risks. John, I want to hear from you. We've the obvious risks. My house is on the coastal plain. It's gonna, if I leave it like this, it's going to go wash away in 2 years. Now, the flip side, Bob, like you mentioned, most Americans, that house represents probably your second, if not largest, asset in retirement that could be washed away. So you've got a social risk. What are the other obvious, or I should say less than obvious risks, John, that you think the insurance companies could, or the insurance industry could help address?
Well, to me, it's interesting because you kind of immediately go to, we all do. We kind of go to sort of the property casualty side of that insurance discussion, and you go there because that's the thing that's in the forefront of our minds. And maybe to your point, it's because that's where our largest assets are. But Bob made a very interesting quote, which I wrote down, which I thought was great, about the insurance sets the rules for human behavior. And I thought that was really interesting because in kind of, sitting here in part of tri-state in the edge of New England is there's a huge, life and health insurance industry here. And it's interesting because we don't hear those companies typically talking about ESG and climate change as really impacting them, where they think it's only an issue. But when Bob puts it in terms of the human behavior, that insurance sets the rules for human behavior, that applies across the board to both property casualty and with life and health companies as well. And I thought that was very interesting to me, because that a little light bulb went on for me. So I see that as kind of a pearl with respect to ESG investing that sort of opens up the insurance sector, if you will, to a much broader audience to listen to these concepts and think about what does it mean for them, and follow sort of Bob's, when he went through it and laid out that from sort of climate change, we can't argue it's changing, but we can debate what's causing it, to what the impacts are. And you can start to show the impacts to your house on the shore that's more at risk today, but also you can I think protract that to certain lifestyle or choices or behavior choices that people make that increase their own personal risk, their own health risk, or their own life risk. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I think it really opens it up more broadly.
What about from a transition perspective? I read how many jobs green energy will create, but then Bob, if I'm 57 years old and I'm a miner in West Virginia, I don't know anyone who fits that category, so I better. That may be great for other people. It's not for me. I mean, could products like annuities help fund broad scale transitions from one sector driving jobs to another? I mean, has there been much exploration on that power of the insurance company?
Mm-hmm. Andy, you want to pick up on the transition issues? I'll pick it up on the back of your statement. How's that?
Yeah, I think transition is a very important thing just in general. We haven't explored specifically using things like annuities, but I do think in general, this idea of, how does the U.S., how does the world transition to a clean economy, I think is something that definitely resonates with people. And as we can see now with our energy crisis that we're experiencing here in America, it's at the forefront of people's minds. And so I do think that there has, this idea of a just energy transition is something that resonates with people, because it is not easy enough just to snap your fingers and weave in yourself the world of coal, right? With places in the United States, there's some utility companies that right now are over 50% coal production still and using from a power output. That being said, when Bob talks about these things like climate risks, and we see the amount of externalities that are associated with coal, not just climate change factors, but also just overall health. If you look at the number of people that have died from just coal power in general, whether it's from a mining perspective or just the communities that are at these coal-fired plants, it's a lot, and it has some externalities. And so we do have to kind of take those things into consideration and weigh the cost-benefit analysis of these jobs in places like West Virginia, and also the effects that it has on those communities, on those people. But it's a double-edged sword. And I think, at Sage, we like to think about a pragmatic transition. And I think that's going to be the key, is we can't, with our supply chains, we can't just say, let's build all wind and solar overnight and then have battery storage to try to supplement it. That's just not feasible right now. And so we have to have these conversations as to what does it look like? What are we doing now? What are we doing 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And we have to keep on adapting and looking at, every year is different, right? We didn't necessarily anticipate Russia to invade Ukraine. So we now have to adapt and kind of reassess, the then and now. It's great to have a plan, but right now we're seeing that kind of that plan is getting thrown upon itself, and now we have to address it. So hopefully that covers kind of a big picture view of how Sage views the transition. On the insurance side, I know Bob might have some good perspectives on potential innovative products and other ways to look at the industry as well.
I think that if I'm looking at it purely from the annuity side of the business, the industry has had some significant challenges over the last several years of the newer generation, our X generation, our millennials are underinsured when it comes to life and annuity purchases, even during the early parts of their family formation. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Maybe because, we have issues with regard to the means by which the industry distributes its product, you sit down and look at the life industry, it's the same old as it was back in 1955. I'm going to go down buy a life policy from my local agent, just like my dad did. When the vast majority, the largest segment of our workforce does everything online. Nothing is done in a store anymore. And so that goes for annuity products and life products. And so this is where insurance tech, I think, is going to take us to another level inside the industry, and large underwriters have to wake up and get with the party. Second thing is that we are entering a phase that we have never seen in the history of the United States. It's what we would call the great decumulation. And for the last 5 decades, we've done only one thing, and the whole financial services industry has only promoted one thing: the accumulation of savings and wealth. Because the baby boomers were it. Now the boomers are all going to decumulation. We have one of a slide that we have is 2 people, and this woman's, jumping over this older man on the beach. She says, "Oh, I'm a teenager." And so life is carefree, as a teenager. But the fact of the matter is we've undersaved, and we were sadly underprepared for the great decumulation when you look at the average balances in 401ks and so forth. And so retirement income and retirement income design is probably job one for the insurance industry right now, because if we don't, that S in ESG, unfortunately, is going to be sadly tested by public services that are going to be drawn on by the number of people who are the boomers or in their retirement years that have no savings. And so what do we do about this? And this is where the insurance industry, I think, has a great opportunity. And then the second thing is that the last thing I'll leave you with is that how do I get a millennial to buy a life contract or an annuity, particularly since they just bought a new home and they need to protect their family? Well, maybe product design should include some sustainable investing, some thematic investing that they can relate to, rather than we'll just take your money and stick it in the same old big old oil companies and mining companies and so forth. Product design at the investment level will help and aid in accumulating assets from the millennials for the insurance industry.
Oh, I love it. On product design topic, here's one. I was Laura and I were involved in a climate forum about 2 weeks ago, and Nature Conservancy was there and heard about parametric insurance and what they're doing with a coral reef off the peninsula of Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. So hurricane hits said ocean reef. Funds have been contributed by all of the resorts, I guess, and properties benefiting from this, gets paid to group taking care of said reef. I don't know, John, is that a future product?
Well, I mean, clearly it is a future product in terms of I think in terms of the type of things that we're going to insure. It's not just building and contents and maybe business interruption. It's actually insuring those things that are necessary for us or me as an enterprise to actually continue to be able to do or continue to be able to pay for to keep my business going and make it sustainable. It's not just sort of that sort of precise pinpointed event that happened and the direct damage at the time. It's basically how about my sustainability and my long-term projection as a company. That I think is starting to become subject of insurance. And some people might say that is sort of those intangible things or that you can't insure. Well, I think we have to really think again about things that we've been insuring, and we have to start to insure some of those intangibles that we haven't done before. So
exactly.
I see that. Yeah. I have a question for Emma. It just popped into my head listening to Andy talk and Bob talk about. You talked about sort of there is definite economic value associated by adopting ESG best practices. And you answered that question very well, Emma, about that is there are you giving up a short term, in for longer term? And you answered it very well. The thing that struck me was that it seems to me, but I didn't think about this, that another value of ESG investing is actually giving you as the follower of ESG the ability to be agile and pivot and transition, where other people who may not be taking that view are going to be left struggling a little bit. What do you think about that perspective?
Well, when you're talking about pivoting, maybe taking advantage of upcoming, market trends that we haven't necessarily seen in the past, I think something that ESG kind of focuses on is these changing macroeconomic trends and how that will impact things like investments or even business operations. And that forward-looking kind of way of looking at things, right? That looking forward, understanding risks that are facing us that we've never faced in the past, I think allows ESG investing to be more agile, because we are looking at risks. Let's talk climate change again. We're looking at risks that we haven't faced as a society in the past. And so, financial models in the past don't have these kind of risks built into them. But when you're ESG and, you're an ESG investor, you're thinking about these things. You're thinking about these risks and how to take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the negative externalities out of them, right? So if you're looking toward the future and trying to take advantage of the opportunities, take advantage of maybe investing in companies that are, adopting climate mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies to how they're going to get around the changes that are already happening from climate change. You're taking advantage of those opportunities. Or if you're an insurance company, you're taking advantage of the fact that climate change is going to impact, if you're property casualty, it's going to impact properties, whether it be wildfire or flooding or anything of the nature, that's going to be impacting. So you want to be looking at companies, as an investor that are taking advantage of that. And so I think it allows you to be a little bit more aware of risks that are, coming, and allows you to be a little bit more agile and pivoting towards how you're going to handle those.
I would pick up on that, John, also, and that was excellent points that Emma made. Having been at this for over 30 years, I will tell you that most financial analysis that is taught today in our business schools and in our basic finance and economic courses is really looking at the future through the rear view mirror. It's all based on what was, and somehow or another, it's going to find a cycle to repeat itself. Well, that's never going to be true. And if anything, ESG is the most forward-looking risk analysis that we have at our disposal today to assess what are the known unknowns, okay? Because much of financial analysis is based on known knowns. And so we have to sit here as ESG analysts and say, what is the probability of this event occurring, and therefore what would be the financial material impact potentially to the capital value of this organization? And we bring in all kinds of different science considerations to evaluate that, as well as psychology in terms of what is the human interaction. But I'll take it even one step further to be even more current about it. And one of the things that we're considering, we're kicking around ideas about a paper to be written, which something along the lines of, when bullets fly, does ESG die? And the current turmoil, the war, the invasion that we are seeing occur now in Central Europe tells you a lot about what we missed, even in our ESG analysis, when it comes to looking at sovereigns and how they interact with each other and what the potential impact is, the fallout that will occur that has the potential of an ESG disaster, the likes of which we can't even think about. And so here again, we find it almost incredulous that people would still be sitting here saying, I don't mind investing in companies who support regimes that don't mind killing women and children at will. There's something wrong with that from an ESG complex perspective, even from the insurable risk side. And so intentionality is a very important aspect of governance at the corporate level, but it is on the sovereign level as well. And so authoritarian regimes are probably never going to make it, and certainly for SAGE, into the ESG landscape. Although for some it does. And I think there's a large part of Wall Street today that unfortunately suffers from this duality. And if there's anything that I would say that's moral about ESG, this is the area that I think it really is something to consider in terms of the ESG complex. When does Inhumanity enter your framework for ESG risk analysis?
Well, I think when Chernobyl is attacked and a couple other nuclear reactors are attacked, and suddenly we were worried about toilet paper. Suddenly the iodine tablets get in short supply in Europe. I think, Bob, that says a lot, right? About
let's think of it. You can take it one step further, Paul, and here we are listening to what would be a madman talk about using some kind of a tactical nuclear warhead.
Yes.
And dropping it in the center of Ukraine. Now, do you realize that the spill-out effect of that, just dropping it in the middle of the wheat fields of the fourth largest producer of wheat on the planet, do you understand what the starvation will be felt through North Africa, the Middle East, and Western Europe? Unparalleled. And never, ever to be used for the rest of our lifetimes. That will be totally eradicated. And so these are the strategic issues that we think about in ESG. Because the fallout from a social perspective is almost unimaginable, but it's that simple. And so, I think that, yes, it's important to consider, the rights of people and so forth, but we now are taking it to the next step and say, if in fact they do this, what are the ripple out effects in terms of, food and availability of food to not only Europeans, but we were reading the other day about Egypt. 70% of Egypt's wheat intake for its 107 million people comes from the Ukraine. Will we see a wheat crop planted this year in the Ukraine? I doubt it. So it then has spill-on effects in terms of inflation, which then has spill-on effects in terms of now what is the lifestyle of this economy in terms of making the big adjustment and what gets cut out. Well, I can't have that surgery that was elective. I'm not going for my cancer therapies because I can't afford it. There's a number of other things that start to have a knock-on effect that will have a very diminishing economic impact, but also have adverse insurance consequences. And so these are the things that, you don't want to sit there and go too far down that rabbit hole. But this is where ESG, I think, is an immensely strong advantage in terms of how to think about the world and what the potential outcomes are.
Well, this has been fascinating. We're sort of at the top of the hour here. And John, maybe bring it home. One thought I had, it's interesting. How do you get that type of thinking, and who is in a position to do it? You think we started talking about the obvious property and casualty risk. Floods, famine, 1 in 100 year events. Yet the whole insurance company is written. They only, you could say that the insurance company only has a 12-month perspective because that's when the policies are up, right? So where do we go from here?
Well, I think that's really interesting, and that was like one of the questions almost exactly about the question I had, and I was going to pitch that question to Andy because, you clearly see sort of roadblocks or barriers to people or organizations adopting ESG thinking. But then we also see, like in recent weeks, like with companies like Swiss Re accelerating their adoption. And I wanted to get, Andy, your perspective on that. What do you see as the roadblocks, but what do you see as the things that once a company gets it, like Swiss Re, I think has gotten it and has been championing this approach to ESG in the recent years, particularly, probably even longer than that. But and then now they're accelerating their implementation.
That's a great question. I really think it does, first off, start at the top, right? There has to be a commitment from the board and executive management to basically press the I believe button that this is a value driver, right? It's solid risk management. It's not meant to be a virtue signaling tool, and it's meant to help both manage risk as well as create long-term value for you, your shareholders, your stakeholders, your employees, everybody. And so I think it really needs to start out at the board of directors level. We need to see things like, do we have a sustainability committee on that board of directors? A lot of companies don't have that first step that is a big one that's necessary. I think once that gets in place, right, and it becomes the part of the DNA of the firm company level, I think we're going to see a lot of movement on actually seeing progress, right? Because now you have a board that's going to be monitoring progress, seeing if are we hiring new employees that have specialty skills that help us manage and disclose on ESG data? And that's just at the operations level, right? When you start talking about the investment level, we need to help actually manage ESG better at the investment level. We need all these other companies that are, part of that investing bucket to also be making those changes. So it's a big ecosystem, I think, and it all starts at management and the boards, pushing for that change. And that can be, as investors, we have the ability from, shareholder advocacy to help steer that. But so it can come from there's a lot of different angles that we can start seeing kind of a push for it. And I think that once we see that, we're going to see a lot better reporting, a lot better management of it. And I think that's kind of, when we start at the top, we really will see a lot of improvement. Mm-hmm. And again, it's, there's so many positive benefits from ESG management. It can be brand value, right? We talked about the millennials and Gen Zers and your employees that really want to see those kind of ESG initiatives. You have good employee retention when you start looking at things like human capital, in the great resignation that we're seeing, there's benefits there. I mean, we could talk for hours about the benefits both at the investing and operations level. Mm-hmm. So for companies that aren't doing it, it's really just a missed opportunity in our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting, and one thing that really struck me was the point that Bob made, and this takes us back to since I work, I sit and work and live in a business school. And Bob's point about how teaching finance today has been based upon, teaching finance by looking in the rear view mirror. And having worked in the actual insurance industry for a lot of years, I used to equate that with the actuarial science. That was what actuaries did, was basically predict the future by looking in the rear view mirror. And now it's interestingly, because I think actuaries are coming around saying now they really need to be, business analytics. They need to be thinking about not only the past does have some input, but it isn't the total direction. You got to be forward thinking. And Bob's thing that really woke me up was sort of saying, wait a minute, we got to how do we teach finance leaders of the future to think about not just, it's not just the same ratio analysis that we practiced for decades, if not longer than that, to determine financial creditworthiness or stability. It's actually also their ability as an organization to look forward and if when appropriate, being able to pivot and change in a very agile way. So.
Yep, I would agree. I think the one thing I would point out to in terms of John's observation is that there are changes that are occurring beyond business school, and certainly the CFA Institute stands tall in that regard. And they very recently developed a ESG certification that every financial professional can now take. And both Andy and Emma have taken it, and they are now certified at the CFA level. I'd be curious to see what you both had to say about and what kind of encouragement you would give people to consider doing that certification.
I think it's a great certification. I think it's points out all these kind of things that we're talking about in terms of, how it's impacting financial models, how it's impacting how we look at the world of finance and investing, going forward, and how, all these points about climate change and affecting, all kinds of areas that you wouldn't necessarily think about. So I think it's, a great certification to take, and I definitely would suggest investment professionals take a look at it.
Yeah, I think from investment professionals as well as people in corporate jobs, corporate finance, for example, I think there's a lot of misnomers on what ESG is. And that's kind of in our political landscape. We see a lot of people making assumptions on what they think ESG is. I think the CFA lays out what kind of a broad understanding that ESG doesn't necessarily always mean the same thing to each person. And there are some differences in opinions, but there's some overarching themes of how to look at things. And you may not come to the same conclusion. Like Emma and I may look at the same ESG related data and come to separate conclusions. We're both going through similar analytical processes to look at that. And so I think that helps people kind of understand that not everybody's going to agree, but the processes in developing this kind of movement going forward, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of good foundations in place already.
So to wrap back to the earlier part of our conversation where we're talking about the soul, I'd love to ask our guests, what is your why? So in a few words, what is your why? Why do you have so much passion? I mean, Bob, your passion just pours through with the information you share. Let's start with you. Why do you wake up and do this every day?
I suppose because I care about my grandchildren. I care about my children. I look at the beauty that exists in this world. I've been lucky to see all the things that it offers. I've lived all over the world, and there's a lot more that we have in common with people than not. And the one common thing is let's protect what we have been given. And so at some point you have to sit up and say, I'm gonna try and change this. And that's really where it came from for me, because you want to leave this world having made a difference. And this is, as much as anything, this is the best way to do it, in my mind.
Thank you. Andy, what is your why?
I think with ESG in general, there's a lot of good as we're looking for outcomes. I think the idea is that financial outcomes are one part of an overall picture of just general outcomes for people, good health and well-being, whether it's having not being prone to the effects of climate change, having a long-term job. There's a lot of different things in society that we want as outcomes, and they tie into the financial outcome as well. I think that's the key point, is that if your life suffers, there are also negative externalities, and I think that the idea that this kind of short-termism that sort of predominantly kind of is in our corporate America DNA and not a long-term outcome. Like, it's great maybe if I'm making a lot of money now, but if I'm, homeless on the streets 20 years from now, like I really didn't make a good financial decision. And that's what we're kind of seeing, is that with things like climate change, there are going to be negative externalities. We're seeing them now, but they may only get worse later on. But we also have to manage climate change with people's good health and well-being in terms of having a steady job. We can't just focus so much on climate change that we ignore a productive economy, because there'll be negative outcomes there. And I think the cool part about ESG is that we get to kind of work and try to balance all those things, right? It's a delicate balance, and at Sage and in investing world, we get to have our opinion on how to balance that. And I think that's the cool part, is trying to weigh the scales and really have the ability to try to manage all of it together.
Those are both
Emma,
great
how about
answers,
yourself?
and I definitely relate to a lot of what Bob and Andy just said. But I would say there's a couple of reasons. One, this landscape of ESG, sustainable investing, is ever changing. It's evolving. It's taking every day as a new day and discovering new externalities, whether positive or negative, out of these kind of factors that we look at. And so it's an exciting place to be in terms of it's a growing and evolving space of investing. It's a growing and evolving space of, the investing world. And so it's an exciting space to be in from that perspective. I also love the interconnectedness of it. I like that it's a holistic picture of, investments in life. It blends everything together. I think we talked about that a lot today, about how all of these factors are interconnected, whether you're looking at it from, an insurance company perspective or looking at it from just a human perspective. I think the interconnectedness of this information and the ability to look at it, not just from the investing side, but the holistic side is really interesting to me as well.
It's fantastic. And Anthony, I'm curious from your perspective, being, a current student and listening to this conversation and having your own personal interest, what is your why? What fuels your engagement with ESG?
Well, for me, I feel that, where we sit in time now, we have a great responsibility as stewards for the current and future generation. We currently sit in history's most advanced economy with our most sophisticated investors yet. And there's no reason why we can't move the needle forward in the way that we do things. So that's it for me. I think we should be doing everything that we can in order to keep becoming more sophisticated and getting those positive externalities for society. It no longer needs to be a me game. We can do it for we now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Very well said.
All right. Hey, listen, thanks so much. Absolutely critically important topic, John. So,
Absolutely.
Laura, Anthony, Emma, Andrew, Bob, thanks so much. And
Thank you.
for our listeners, join us again next week, for continuing podcast series with this Barney School. So, John, thank you. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.